Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of the Supernova podcast. Today we have the immense pleasure to welcome Julien Fortin. Julien, hello.
Hello, Sophie. How are you? Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining us from Mexico, right?
Right? Mm-hmm.
So, Julien, you're an explorer. You're
Mm-hmm.
also a scientific cave diver.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, you trained as an industrial engineer who specialized in production
Mm-hmm.
and also automation. But you didn't quite follow the traditional path. You've been traveling extensively, working on development projects. You've lived in many different places, including Germany, Sri Lanka, Mexico, India, Gabon. You've also worked on some projects in Mauritania, Nepal, Senegal, if I'm
Mm-hmm.
correct.
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm.
So you're a traveler. You have also written and published 3 books, and today you're also a partner and leadership trainer at High Realities. So all
That's
of that in
correct.
one person, Julien. So again, trained as an engineer, you didn't quite follow the traditional path that would have taken you to a corporate career, maybe in large corporations. Can you tell our audience what took you to becoming an explorer and a cave diver?
Well, it's a good question. And to be honest, it would be very easy, in hindsight, to pretend that I had a grand plan. It would be very easy in hindsight to pretend that there was a red thread that I was following, that one step logically led to the other. But that would be just a blatant lie. I really didn't have a plan. And if I can use like a pop culture reference to explain a little bit more what happened, I don't know if you know Jim Carrey, the actor, right?
Of course, I
He
do. Uh-huh.
There you go. So he's done a lot of movies over the years, but one that he did was called Yes Man. And it was like that movie where at the beginning, all his friends say he's a little bit grumpy and he says no to everything. When they ask him, do you want to go to see a movie? He says no. Do you want to come out and have dinner? He says no, almost by default. And then they dare him to say yes to everything for a week. And during that week, he learns like emergency first response. He learns Korean. He jumps from a plane with a parachute. And of course, it's a little bit of a silly premise for a movie and it's a comedy. But I think there is a bit of truth to that, which is that as soon as you start saying yes to things you hadn't planned, things tend to happen that were not in your original plan. And then you end up in the exact scheme that John Lennon was describing when he was saying that life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And I'm guessing that, that's exactly what happened to me. I started saying yes to things as the opportunities arose. And the thing is, it's very exponential in the sense that once you say yes to something and you go through one door, there's 3 doors behind that one. And behind each of those doors, there are 3 more doors. And then you end up in places where you never thought you would be. And again, you could pretend there was a plan, but there wasn't. So I would say it was more of a thirst for learning and maybe, enough recklessness to say yes to think without overthinking it too much that led me to do all of these things. And so that's what happened. That's what created this mess of a CV that you were mentioning right now.
You were in Germany now when it all started. You were 19, I believe. You were in Munich. You had
Yeah.
this drink session with friends, if I'm not wrong, and you decided at that moment to take the leap and go to India. I'm taking a lot of shortcuts, but
Yeah,
I
well,
remember something very
it's pretty much that. I mean, if you want to even go one step backward, when I was 7 years old and I was going on holiday at my grandparents' place in the Alps in France, I met that German girl, Ilka Zetzefand, I remember, and she was interesting and she was funny and she was cute. And so when I turned 11 or 12, I took the decision to learn German because I had met once a German girl when I was 7. And then
uh-huh.
doing that led me to want to study in Germany 10 years later. And then being in Germany, I just thought that was when I was 19 and I moved away 1,000 kilometers away from Paris where I grew up. And it was incredibly cool. It was interesting because it was a different culture. It was different people. It was just so stimulating to be outside of my comfort zone ever so slightly. Because I mean, the German culture is not that much, that different from the French culture. It's still very European. but it was already like an eye opener and a door opener for me. And so I thought that if being 1,000 kilometers away from what I considered home at this time was so cool, then I should go even further and would be linearly cooler, you know? And so I decided to go to Australia, went to the bar to tell my friends I wanted to go to Australia because Australia was the furthest you could go. And the guy at the bar next to me said, forget Australia. My sister married a Tamil guy. And I asked what a Tamil guy was, learned it was, you know, people in south of India, and then I decided to go to India. But again, it's that thing where saying that I had a plan would be really a gross exaggeration of my capacity to plan. So that's the way it happened. And so, you know, you meet a girl when you're 7 years old in France, and then you end up in Germany, and that leads you to a guy whose sister was in India, and then you go to India. That's pretty much
we have to trust what Steve Jobs tells us now, that it all makes sense at the end, looking at all the dots.
And maybe it doesn't, but then I think that our only job is to make sense out of it, you know, like maybe it doesn't make sense, but we can make sense out of that. And I think that's one of the great freedom of human beings, is to take disconnected dots and we can choose however we want to connect them. So that's creating sense, even if there was none in the first place.
So the funny story is, this friend initially was planning to go with you, and you were planning to stay with the in-laws, right? And
yes.
And the destiny that decided otherwise. He didn't come, but you went anyway. And this is where the troubles all started. I'm gonna leave it at that. But I know we both share values, very strong values of creation and freedom. And I'm curious for you to share, you know, with this audience, how does it transpire in how you approach both entrepreneurship, since it's the way you've maintained your livelihood for many years now, but also cave diving as a way to live those values of creation and freedom?
Well, that's the interesting part, is that, you know, entrepreneurship or, you know, cave diving or even writing or traveling or studying abroad, all these dots seem very disconnected. That's exactly what we're talking about right now. But I wouldn't say that I saw a connection straight away, but I do feel a connection between those different points. Or if I can say it in a different way, I try to bring the same values and aspirations to all of those different points. So I would say you're talking about, you know, the values of creation and freedom, and the importance that both you and me put into these two things. And I agree, but I also think that those are words that are used maybe too much, and therefore sometimes they might be slightly misunderstood. So for instance, to me, you know, freedom is not necessarily the absence of issues or constraints of links, you know, like very often people think of freedom as, you know, a poor lonesome cowboy, you know, like walking away in the sunset and having
Or the digital nomads. Yeah.
Exactly, and having no worry in the world, but also no commitment, no attachment, and so on. And I really don't believe freedom to be that. Because if you spend your entire life destroying every commitment you could have, or making sure to not be tied to something, you're just as unfree as you would be if you had all those commitments. Because, you know, defining yourself as a negative to something is just as alienating as defining yourself as a positive to something, right? So refusing something is not freeing you from it, right? And so
fully agree. Yes.
I would say that defining freedom is way beyond my philosophical capacity, you know, of saying what it is or what it should be. But I would say that for me, it's not so much aiming for freedom than it is exploring at what freedom might be. And so that's where exploration come into place, is that when something is interesting to you or intriguing to you, like the concept of freedom, like the concept of creation, like the concept of entrepreneurship, more importantly than having clear ideas of what it should be, you should come in with an open mind of exploring what it all encompasses for you, what it could encompass, what it can encompass for other people. And so I would say that my quest for freedom, more than a quest for freedom itself, is more of an exploration of all of the different aspects that they could be, you know, and in it. And that's where, to me, connects very well to my job as an explorer, because basically the idea is to use all of your consciousness, all of your physical and mental capacity, all of the resources that are given to you, that you earn for yourself, and all of the opportunities that life and the world are providing to you, to basically shed light on something that was dark before. Maybe not for the rest of your world, but at least for yourself, right? And so exploring a cave for me is exactly that. It's going to places. And, you know, very often I hear cave divers saying, oh, we're going to places where nobody has ever been. And then, you know, then you find human remains in a cave that are 10,000 years old. Like, well, actually, I'm not the first one. You know, someone was a much
Maybe the
bolder
second.
explorer than me, you know, and went there before. And so what I mean is, it would be almost arrogant to think that exploring something means that you're discovering something new for the world, for humanity. But just shedding your own light on something is already adding a little bit to the common knowledge of people, to the common experience of humanity, you know, and that is good enough. There is a famous French philosopher called Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And, you know, I think it was end of the 19th century or something like that, where he coined that concept of the noosphere, which is the idea that all of the thoughts, all of the efforts, all of the energy of humanity goes into a common sphere that is surrounding the Earth. And that is called the noosphere. And the noosphere is basically the sum of all of the thoughts of humanity, right? And I do not believe in it as a reality, but I believe that it is a very powerful image to think that every single effort you put into life, into exploring concepts, into creating companies, into creating livelihood, into interacting with the material world, participates in a global thing, participates in a global, you know, enterprise, in a global brain, in a global common thought process and reserve. And so, again, I don't believe it's true in the very literal sense of the term, but I believe that thinking like that tends to help give meaning to what you do, because as an individual, it can be, you know, of course, we have very little power. Of course, we have very little influence on what's happening in the universe. But if you consider that you're part of that noosphere, that every effort you're making participates into shedding light into some concept or expanding the global freedom, then it starts becoming, you know, more interesting and perhaps more fun as well.
Mm-hmm. And you speak also about knowledge, right? So shedding light, bringing knowledge. You work with the underworld, and then suddenly you also contribute to creating the knowledge of how it looks under our feet, obviously. And can you tell us about that passion for creating knowledge?
Well, again, it's the like it's interesting that you say creating knowledge, and I don't know if we ever create knowledge, you know, because we're all standing on the shoulder of giants. So whatever we do, we don't really create knowledge, but maybe we transform knowledge a little bit. So, you know, I would say that if you write a book, what you're doing is processing the thousands of books you've read before and adding one page to it, right? So, you know, what have we created there? We've transformed things, we've shed a slightly different light, we've taken the torch of our consciousness and pointed it at something from a slightly different angle. I'm not sure we've created any knowledge when we do that, but I think there is value in changing perspectives. Again, you know, like when you're traveling, you're not creating the country you're going to, if you think about it. You know, traveling around the world, you're not creating knowledge. You're discovering knowledge that was already there, and you're adding your own personal perspective on that, right? And so in the same way that when you're traveling, you're not creating the country you're going to, when you're exploring, you're not creating the knowledge you bring back to the surface. You merely are the messenger of something that other people couldn't shed light on, and you're bringing it for other people to see. And so this to me is an interesting process, not of knowledge creation, but of knowledge transformation and transmission. And this to me is a very important part of exploration and cave diving. And, you know, while doing that, the most important thing to me is to be always very conscious of what a privilege it is. Like in the sense, you know, yesterday itself, I was diving with two very dear friends, and we're exploring cave. And again, so that means we're exploring somewhere where no other cave divers had been before, but it doesn't mean nobody had been there before, because, you know, you see bones of a sloth, where that sloth from the Pleistocene was the original explorer of that cave in a time where it used to be dry, right? So who are we? We're just second or third at best. But you have the impression sometimes going through this passage that you're flying through an underwater Guggenheim museum filled with stone Modiglianis, right? And to me, to have the incredible opportunity and luck to see that with my own eyes with two dear friends, like this is to me much more important than whatever, you know, nugget of knowledge I might bring back to the surface, is feeling so incredibly privileged and lucky that you can see a place of beauty like that very few people have access to. And, you know, if you stop while you're doing that, and I do that every now and then in cave, I just stop and I think, I am seeing what I'm seeing right now. And it was very unlikely that would ever happen. You know, when I was born in Châtenay-Malabry at the beginning of the 80s, the likelihood of me seeing that particular speleothem that looks like a sculpture of Modigliani in another water cave in Mexico was almost zero. And now I am there. I am seeing that. And what an incredible strain of luck to be able to do that. And so
incredible. And Julien, in which area of Mexico were you yesterday?
Yucatan. I'm actually in the Yucatan Peninsula.
Yes.
Well, so not in the Yucatan state. I'm in the state of Quintana Roo, which is on the eastern part of the Yucatan Peninsula in southeastern Mexico.
Excellent. And you talked about beauty. What was the most exciting or beautiful expedition that you conducted?
So I would argue that there is beauty everywhere, and that, some of the most interesting theater plays I've seen were just sitting on the side of the street in India with a cup of chai and watching the Gran Teatro del Mundo, like just watching what's happening like in front of us. So everything can be beautiful, but I would say that some moments can be really extremely interesting. And I would say two stick to my mind right now. I'm diving with a close group of friends. There is Sam, there is Fred, there is Chris, there is Andreas, a couple of people like that coming from all over the world, from Brittany, from Norway, from the US, from Canada, Mexico. And a couple of years ago, I was on an exploration project with Andreas. And we were looking at some passages that look very small, and we had to really go into duck under, so very low ceiling areas with a lot of percolation being like in your coffee machine where stuff percolates through the coffee ground. Well, what was percolating right now was basically dust and calcite from the ceiling through the water, so very low visibility where you don't see that well. Plus there was a halocline, which is the interface between freshwater and saltwater. And because freshwater and saltwater have different refraction indexes, when they mix, everything becomes blurry. So it's transparent around you, but you cannot see well because it's blurry. It's as if you're losing your specs, and all of a sudden the world doesn't look that clear anymore. And so we were doing that exploration, and it wasn't easy, and it was not obvious where the cave was going. And all of a sudden we go through a couple of restrictions and end up with that absolutely massive passage. But I'm talking about a passage big enough to drive a train through it. And so all of a sudden it's really like being Alice in Wonderland, and going through that small door and discovering there is another infra world beyond the infra world. And I remember the pure, almost childish joy of both of us arriving in that world that we didn't know existed, an hour before. And so I would say that joy of discovering something that big behind something that unfriendly is really a fantastic, souvenir for me, right? And
how does it translate when you communicated with Andreas, right, yesterday? I imagine with all the equipment, etc., and without really seeing each other's, facial expressions, how would you communicate that joy?
So there are two things to that. First of all, cave divers tend to be a little bit like, I wouldn't say outsiders, but like it's not necessarily the people you will see the most, expressing and being on social media and so on. It can be a little bit of a rough world in a way. So, if you saw my friend Andreas, for instance, in a dark alley at night or something like that, you probably would turn around, and me too, like is that big Viking of a man with a bald head and a huge beard, and so on. And he's one of the loveliest human beings I know. But what I mean is not necessarily someone who's going to be like, oh, how wonderful to see this, right? But that's exactly the thing. Is first of all, we communicate with hand signals, right? And I can hear, we use rebreathers, and a rebreather is basically something you use to recycle the gas you're breathing so that you have more time in the cave. And it has like the mouthpiece is actually hanging on the door behind me over there drying.
Oh yeah, we can see it. Yes.
Exactly. And that mouthpiece, has a little bit of dead air space
in there.
So it's enormous. And the thing is, when you do a noise, a sound in there, it tends to echo a little bit. And so just hearing the of like beauty and awe of someone, it starts echoing in that. And so I remember hearing Andreas like laughing in his mouthpiece, like for example, that day. And to me, that was the expression of joy and beauty that you can have when you see that, right? And it's interesting.
That's amazing. And I can only imagine also how close you feel to this person communicating like this and seeing something like that for the first time. It must be
It creates an
difficult.
interesting bond. I would say that there are and again, it's not only cave diving. I would say it can also be like difficult times in life, or a shared project, or creating a company together, or anything which is difficult where two people or more people have to work together. They can act as catalysts for human relationship, which mean that if you do something difficult or dangerous or challenging for a month with someone, I would say that that month is worth a year of relationship with someone else, if you know what I mean. And so difficult and challenging situations, though they are difficult and though there are things that we would rather not live through, actually have a huge value in them, not only in terms of what they do to us as individuals, but also they can be catalysts for relationship with the people with whom we go through them, right? And I would say that in cave diving, some of the friends I have through that are not my oldest friends, not by a long shot. They're people I've known for 3, 4, 5 years, which is not that big in the grand scheme of things. But the level of trust and the level of respect and the level of friendship and just of pure human connection I have with them almost matches people I've met for 15 or 20 years ago. And so the catalytic value of challenges to human relationships is something to not be forgotten.
Yeah, I think I can relate. I mean, definitely. And you talk about trust, and indeed, cave diving is a very dangerous discipline, right? So how, what are the risks exactly that come with this practice, and
Well,
how do you mitigate them?
well, drowning comes to mind because you're
Drowning
underwater
comes
and
to
we're not
mind.
fish. We're not fish and we're underwater. So obviously it's a very stupid idea. But no, I would say, first of all, there is always a risk in everything. And if you think about it, the most lethal things of all is life, because to be able to die, you need to be able to be alive. So being born is probably the most dangerous thing you can ever do. And so life being that lethal, it tends to, make risks a little bit more relative. So I would say that cave diving or driving a motorcycle or going in the mountains or anything like that is dangerous. And denying the risks is not a good strategy. So, it's not about saying, oh, things are not dangerous or there is no additional risk. This would be being reckless. But, I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't mind adrenaline, but I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I'm not seeking it in any way, shape, or form. And though people might understand cave diving, for example, as an extreme sport and put in the same mental drawer as any Red Bull advertisement of people jumping off a plane or something like that, to me, it's the opposite. If I feel adrenaline during a cave dive, something went horribly wrong. I'm not supposed to feel adrenaline. I'm supposed, I would say that cave diving on a good day is much closer to meditation than it is to an extreme sport. You're supposed to be completely in control. You're supposed to be extremely aware of everything that is happening in you. Adrenaline is drowning all of the other sensations and thoughts in your body. It's overwhelming. You do bungee jumping, you're not necessarily perceiving all of the subtleties of smaller emotions within you. All you're perceiving is that the ground coming closer to you at a high speed, right? And in cave diving, I need to be aware of three things. I need to be aware of my equipment, of my team, and my environment at all time. It's the environmental awareness encompasses those three elements, right? And I'm also a part of that team. And so I need to be focused. I need to be concentrated. I need to be aware. And therefore, we need to be like in that frame of mind where risk is something that we control, not something that we use as a substitute for adrenaline or for lack of excitement at the surface. It's not at all what it is. So I would say that the way we mitigate risk, and the biggest risk would be drowning is the ultimate risk, right? But what leads to drowning usually would be either equipment failure, I would say, would be one of the risks there. They wouldn't have planned properly. And in the case of cave diving, navigation is one of the biggest issues, because a
Finding
cave,
your path, your way back,
that's the
right?
thing. Well, finding your way into a cave is something very simple. Any monkey could do that in a matter of hours, but finding the way out is really the tricky part. So being able to be geographically aware of where you are in the cave. So we have equipment, we have environment. And then the third factor, again, is the team. So having absolute trust that nobody in your team is going to do something silly or lose their nerves that could create, for example, a silt out. Something as stupid as you're inside the tunnel, there's almost no visibility. and the person is just like moving their fins the wrong way and creating no visibility and then panicking and then moving away from the line and then pulling the lines with them, the line that we're using finding the exit, in a couple of seconds, the best day of your life could become the worst and last day of your life. So those are the risks involved. Now, the way you mitigate them is, first of all, training. I mean, and again, it's not something you improvise. I mean, you train very hard and you're trying to train physically and mentally to be able to handle those things. You also try to be very harsh with yourself and very aware of what you use for methods. You know, like if something doesn't work, it needs to be changed. If something better comes out, you need to adapt, right? And you need to constantly question the methods you're using. Or if a dive doesn't go exactly as planned, you need to be honest enough to sit with your buddies and say, well, I didn't like what happened there. What did we do differently? Or what should we do differently so it doesn't happen? And maybe something you've done for 5 years shouldn't be done anymore because things changed, right? And so mitigating the risk is all about, one, preparation, two, control during the dive, and then three, debriefing and shedding a hard light on things afterwards. So I would say that those three things applied through to the three elements of actual awareness, which are environment, team, and equipment, is the way you mitigate the risk of cave diving.
Yeah, that's very clear. And do you typically dive with the same people? You typically maintain a team?
Yeah, so I would say that there is maybe a team of 3 or 4 people that are my regular dive buddies, right? And there are people that come on top of that. You know, there is an extended friend, a group of friends and people that I trust for diving. So that maybe brings it to about 10 people, you know? So you have an inner circle of people that I dive in on an extremely regular basis. You have a slightly larger circle of people with whom I involve in projects and so on. But then yeah, there aren't many more than that because, and again, it's not at all a sign of arrogance. It's not even a sign of saying they're not good enough, I'm too good, or I'm not good enough, or they're too good. It's not even that. It's just that
You're putting your life in their hands.
Well, and so that requires two things. It requires trust, but it also requires a common language. And so imagine, for instance, that I'm choosing a certain toolbox for cave diving because I'm of the opinion that that toolbox works very well for me and I believe in that toolbox. Maybe another team of divers has another toolbox that they've chosen for different reasons because they're different people or diving different circumstances or they have a different history or different view or different beliefs. There is no problem with that. But if we do not have the same toolbox, we do not speak the same language, and therefore we could both be right and still end up in a horribly wrong situation. So what I mean is you need a group of people with whom you share common tools and language, and you need people with whom you share also a certain human bond. Because if you don't trust people, and if you're not ready to spend an inordinate amount of hour with people in an uncomfortable situation, then you shouldn't be diving with them. And this almost mechanically reduces the number of candidates suitable for that.
Certainly. So you're talking about excellent communication. You're talking about this willingness to spend time together. You talked about trust, many ingredients of high-performing teams.
Absolutely. And it's what's interesting there. And to me, this is also where, you know, again, what you just said about cave diving right now is true for corporate world and entrepreneurship, for instance, right? All of the elements we've said right now, you know, I'm saying that situational awareness is based on 3 levels, which is team, equipment, and environment. Well, this is true in the corporate world. You know, you have equipment, which is more your resources. You know, you definitely have a team because you have people you work with, right? And you have your environment, which is like the company you work in and the constellation of clients around it, right? So I would say that being aware of all those aspects at all time and creating a culture of common language and also of deep human connections to be able to perform is something that is very important in the corporate world and in creating things. I would say it's very important also in the world of sports at the surface, not only exploration. I would argue that it's also very important in a more intellectual world, you know, like when you have people creating a school of thoughts, you know, like, I don't know, you have like German expressionists coming together to create Der Blaue Reiter, you know, in the 1910s, right? Or Die Brücke in North Germany or something like that. You need people who come and share common values and who are very aware of what's happening at a given moment in terms of their team, their environment, and their resources, right? And if you don't have that, you don't create anything on the human level. So cave diving,
there you go in check also, no?
Sorry?
There you go in check as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's exactly that. And so being able to always be true to reality and have reality checks on the three different levels. So not only talking, but matching reality, matching the material world with those values through the triple situational awareness of equipment, environment, and team is to me a way to keep us honest and also to keep us performant, on every single level and area of life.
And ultimately to keep you to keep you safe when it comes to diving. How
Yeah,
deep do you
absolutely.
typically dive, Julien?
So it's a question that people like to ask a lot because it's something that is very fathomable from outside, right? And so there is two different kind of depth that matter in my job. There is a vertical depth, and so that would be typical, for ocean diving or something like that. You look more at vertical depth, right? And there is penetration depth. So you go into the cave and then you go horizontally into the cave. And in
Yeah.
cave diving, I would say that in the area where I dive here, the Yucatan Peninsula typically is not that deep vertically. So I would say that most of the dives I do on a daily basis are between 0 and 30 meters vertical depth, right?
Okay.
So 0 to 100 feet, 0 to 30 meters. Typically, we have deeper stuff. We've done projects recently down to 50, 60, 70, 80 meters vertical depths, so we have deeper stuff, but generally it's more between 0 and 30. But the crazy extension, the extensiveness of the cave networks in the Yucatan Peninsula mean that we can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5, 7 kilometers away from the last exit. And so that penetration depth is really here in this particular environment, the game we're playing, right? It's really the complexity is added through that more than verticality. There are other areas in the world, for example, Florida, where vertical, the cave is not going to be as long, maybe, or not as complex in terms of navigation, but it's going to be deeper. If you're doing deep ocean diving or wreck studies or photogrammetry of wrecks and so on, then it's going to be the vertical depths and dealing with decompression, which is going to be more complicated. And again,
So challenging for the ears, or what is the challenge that comes with that?
so it's more decompression and planning. So the ears, interestingly, it's more challenging, shallower, because if you think about it, at the surface, you have 1 bar, and every 10 meters of water, you add 1 bar. So if you go from the surface to 5 meters, you go from 1 to 1.5 bars. So those 5 meters are 50% increase. If you go from 40 meters to 45 meters, you go from 5 to 5.5, it's only 10% increase for 5 meters instead of 50. So the deeper you go, the smaller the relative increase with each meter of depth. So the hardest meters for your ears are actually at the surface. Like it's actually the first couple of meters. It's just a bit counterintuitive, but it's something
Very
important.
surprising. Yes. But that's
But
understandable.
the vertical depths plays more of an issue in terms of decompression. So as you go deeper into the water, your body is gonna basically absorb inert gases, which is, for example, nitrogen or helium in the gas you're breathing. And that can only be released at a very moderate speed on the way up. So as you go down, you absorb it. As you go up, you release it. But if you release it too fast, it would be exactly the same as shaking a Coke bottle very hard and then opening it too quick. If you want the Coke bottle to not bubble and spill all over, you need to open the tap of the cap of the Coke bottle very slowly. And in the very same way, you need to release the pressure of the diver's body very slowly, and that's what you do when having controlled ascent. And that's where verticality comes into play, right? So we do have decompression in horizontal caves as well, but typically it's rare that I have more than 1 hour of decompression at the end of a dive, and 1 hour is relatively short, right? Especially if you finish a 7 or 8 hour dive, adding an hour at the end of it is not exactly a big deal, right? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about dives that are typically between 5 and 10 hours. And so adding half an hour, 40 minutes, 1 hour of decompression, if I'm honest with you, I see it as me time because it's time where I cannot move for 30 or 40 or minutes or 60 minutes. So all I can do is be lost in my thoughts and meditate. So I quite enjoy that.
You read my mind because I was about to ask you what are your methods to precisely keep, manage stress, be a trusted, diving partner. Make sure that your cortisol levels don't go to the roof when facing a dangerous situation.
Well, there is two ways of doing things, right? When you're looking at stress, you can look at the stressor or you can look at the stress itself. And so I would say that so far, when we're talking about planning, about training, about understanding, about choosing the right team, about maintaining triple awareness of equipment, environment, and team. What we're doing with there is we're trying to act on the stressors or on the potential stressors. So already by planning, by training, by choosing the right team, by doing all of that, you remove a potential source of stress or a lot of potential sources of stress. So I would say that managing stress starts way upstream by preventing a lot of potential stress from happening by removing the stressors. So that in itself is already a stress management thing. It's not
Like
really stress
checking,
avoidance.
I guess, checking personally your equipment, for example, because I know that
Absolutely.
this is something that you would typically not delegate, right?
Checklists, checking the gas you're going to be breathing, checking the dive plan. You know, like typically we dive as a team, we never dive solo, but every single person in the team needs to have the knowledge, the skills, the experience, and the resources to finish the dive on their own if needed. So, for example, something you wouldn't do would be, where do we go today? Don't worry, I know where we're going. You're like, no, we both need to know where we're going, you know, or how do we use that particular piece of gear we need to keep us alive? Well, don't worry, I know to use that. No, everybody needs to know that. So what I mean is you deal with stress first by trying to remove all potential sources of stress on which you have a control. And that comes with training, that comes with patience, that comes with having the right, team and the right equipment, right? And so doing that already, you're removing a lot of stressors. Now, having said so, it would be a kind of hubris, like to think that you can remove all of the stresses in the world. And I'm not a control freak, or maybe I am, but I'm not big enough of a control freak to think that I could control everything. And so there will be stress. There will be moments where you lose the line. There will be moments where maybe a rock is going to fall and silt out the place. There will be moments where the unexpected happens, right? And interestingly, there is an Indian philosopher called Goenka, and he's the one who brought back the Vipassana meditation technique from Myanmar, from Burma to India in 1974. And he said that there are only two ways to be miserable in life. There are only two situations that can make you feel miserable. And it's either wanted things do not happen or unwanted things do happen. And that's really the two only ways of feeling bad in life. And if you think about it this way, stress is really only one of those two situations. Is something you didn't want to happen, did happen, or something you really wanted to happen, did not happen, right? And that is bound to happen. Again, you can remove a lot of the stressors, and it would be silly of me to put a number on that, but I would say that at least, the majority of stress you can remove by removing the stressors, but there will always be a residual stress that you cannot plan because unwanted things do happen and wanted things do not happen in life. This is the nature of universe and life. And so
That's
I would
how we
say
started
that
this very conversation. Yes.
precisely. And so I would say that the best way to mitigate that kind of stress that you cannot avoid is to work on yourself, because you cannot control the entire universe, but you have a tiny modicum of control over what's happening in your own body and your own mind. So again, training. And so in the same way that you can do push-ups to prepare to have the physical strength to handle physical, challenges, you can do mental push-ups to have the mental strength to handle mental challenges, right? And there are many different ways of doing that. And I wouldn't claim to say or to that I know the best tools for that. But for example, one that has really helped me is meditation. So I've practiced Vipassana meditation for a long time when I was in India. And it's all about awareness and basically a kind of mental health, maintaining control and awareness over your thoughts. So, in the same way that if you want to understand how an engine is working, you need to pop off the hood and look under the hood and see what's happening there. And interestingly, sometimes we can feel stuff happening in our thought processes. We have a very, vague idea of what's happening there, but we don't really know what processes are at play that create stress, that create depression, that create anxiety, that create fear, that create anger. And so I would say that the first step of mitigating stress that you cannot avoid is to shed a light on what's happening in the darkness of your own skull. And again, it's an exploration process. And we're coming back to the same exploration that we had for entrepreneurship, for knowledge, for writing, or for cave diving. It's about shedding light where there was none. And so just spending a little bit of time just looking at what's happening. And if I'm feeling angry, stopping for 1 second saying, all right, I'm angry. I'm not even judging the fact that I'm angry, but why am I angry right now? What led to that? What was the trigger? What was the process that led from the trigger to my reaction of being angry? And stress is usually when stuff is happening in our head that we're not controlling, that we're not understanding. I would say, many different things can make you stressed. You could be late to a meeting at work, and that's stressful. You could be in a cave thinking you're going to drown, and that's stressful. Those situations are vastly different, but they create stress. And the same way that addiction is addiction, stress is stress. It doesn't matter what the stressor is, because stress is generated in our own brain. It's not generated outside. And so understanding which ones are the triggers that generate stress for us is the first step in understanding how we function. And then trying to understand also how that stress is generated from that trigger, because stress is not the trigger. Your boss sending you a message at 1 o'clock in the morning and you're reading it and that creating stress, your boss didn't create stress. Your boss created an email. You made stress out of that email, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm in a cave thinking, oh my God, where is the exit? The cave didn't create stress. The cave was there for millions of years. I'm creating stress. So my point is, once you realize that, you can maybe shed lights in the in-between steps between the trigger and the stress itself. And so one method that I've been using quite a lot, and it's something that we've been using, at Higher Realities. You mentioned the fact that, I'm also participating in a company. I'm a, partner and co-founder of a company called Higher Realities, and with a group of friends and high performance, sport people, we're trying to bring methods from the sport world to the corporate world that we think would be beneficial. And one of the ones that we've been teaching is the 4 steps of thinking, which is basically trying to understand how you get to stress from an external trigger by going from perspective to cognition to basically sensation to reaction. And so trying to cut the problem into chewable pieces. We know what created the stress in the first place. We know we're stressed, but we don't know what's happening in between under the hood. So opening the hood, taking our mental pocket lights and just shining light on the depths of the darkness of our own skull to understand the steps between the stressor and the stress is what we're trying to do. Does that answer your question more or less?
No, of course. And when I teach emotional intelligence, that's very much like one of the first steps that we teach as well, obviously. And so applying this in a real life tense situation is different than just discussing it casually over coffee, right?
Absolutely.
The hard thing is actually to trigger that chain of events to be able to reduce the stress at a given moment.
You're absolutely right. And it's also the thing, before we started this interview, you and me were a little bit casually chatting about, materialism and all of that stuff. And was saying that to me, the material world, materialism, earning a living or making things work in the real world is not something vulgar. It's something that is very much needed. And I'm, if we're talking spirituality, I'm much more on the side of Sri Aurobindo, the Indian philosopher, who talks about bringing the spirit down into the matter than into an ideal spiritual thing that would be like going off in a monastery and foregoing my own body in the world. To me, this is not really useful because, as George Harrison was saying, we live in a material world. And so any spirituality that doesn't have to have an impact on the material world in this only body and life that I have is pretty meaningless to me, right? And so what is important is to have methods, to have tools, to have thoughts, to have values, to have spiritualities that can be brought down into the matter, that can be incarnated in the truest sense of the world, which is in our own flesh, right? And so you're saying right now that emotional intelligence and controlling stress and understanding what's under the hood in our head is not easy to do on the spot, right? It's easy to discuss over a cup of coffee, but it's not easy to do on the spot. And I agree, but if you allow me maybe a very simple comparison, it's a little bit the same as if, you need physical strength to go out of situation. I don't know, there is a rock, you're in the mountains and you need to move a rock to go out of the path, or someone attacks you and you need to defend yourself. If in that moment where you need to defend yourself, you're like, okay, well, now I'm going to do push-ups to gain strength. Like, no, it's too late. Like, it's not useful to do push-ups right now. You're in the situation. Absolutely. But if you've done push-ups every day of your life for the decades before, then the day you need that physical strength to get out of a physical situation, you have it available. And on the emotional and mental level, it's the same thing. it's not the day that you did the emotional strengths or the mental strengths that you should start to do mental push-ups or wonder about which tool to use. You need to have those tools in your toolbox and sharpen them every day of your life so that when the need arises, you're ready to
You're
use it.
ready. Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Yes. So training and muscles, get stronger by training on a regular basis, and then they're ready to.
And so are the
Yes,
mental and emotional muscles.
absolutely. So Julien, you've traveled so much, and yet you say you lived in many places, and yet you say I found my home in Auroville. Auroville
Yes.
is a place in India, in the south of India. To be more exact, it's in 10 kilometers in the north of Pondicherry.
You've done your homework.
And I've done my homework. I've read my books. So I've read your book over the weekend. It's called Auroville. And it tells us about what you found in this incredible city. Maybe for our audience, Auroville was a city that was created, I think, in the 60s. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
68, like all of those
Late 60s.
projects.
Yes. During this period. Yes.
Yes.
A universal city with the purpose to welcome men and women from any kind of nationality and beyond any kind of religious or political belief or practice, correct?
Yeah.
And who today still gathers about 2,000 inhabitants. Although I think daily I read that maybe 15,000 people come to this place
Yes, a lot of people work and interact and participate in the life of it without being officially Aurovilians. Yes.
and about 50 nationalities.
Yes.
And you've spent 10 years of your life in Auroville, correct?
More like 15, to be honest. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I ended up there, and well, so it's very hard
But
for me to make a
can,
difference
can you tell
between,
us? Uh-huh.
yeah.
Sorry, but can you tell us about your what you found in Auroville?
It's well, it's a difficult question, and it's so difficult that I had to write an entire book to try to answer it for myself. So if it was an easy one, I wouldn't have needed to do that, right? But I wasn't looking for anything consciously when I went there, and not searching for anything. Well, I found a lot, and I would
Mhm.
say that we were talking earlier about the fact that when you start opening doors, right, and looking beyond your own comfort zone, but more importantly, beyond your own knowledge, you find things you didn't know were there. And there is that entire goal-oriented versus system-oriented kind of school of thinking that you're probably aware of, that a lot of people try to define goals, and there is value in that. I'm not saying there is no value in defining goals. It's actually very useful. But when you define goals and goals only, you're limited by what you know, because you can only aim and target the goals that are based on your
What you
current
know,
knowledge.
right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And so, if you try to define your dream job, you're limited by all of the jobs you know exist. If you're trying to define your dream place, you're limited by all the parameters and places you know. If you start to be a little bit more open and look more at principles and systems, then you start opening door to things you wouldn't know were there, like Jim Carrey and Yes Men, and you start learning Korean and jumping off a plane, right? Now, Auroville for me was a little bit of that. It's that it broadened completely the scope of what I thought was possible, and it broadened my
You said,
horizon.
if I may, yes, you
Yes.
said the cultural shock was so strong. I was the one who had to change.
Yes, that is very true. I mean, and when you and this is not necessarily Auroville, but it's also India, and India
Uh-huh.
is the most interesting country I've ever been in, and I am aware that saying that is an entirely subjective perspective and point of view. But it's as if you fall in love with someone and you say, this is the most interesting person I've ever met in the entire world. You haven't met everybody in the world. You're not aware of everything, but it is inductively what triggered the biggest emotional response in your life. And that has value in itself, right? And
Mhm.
India is that to me. India is the place that generated the most tremendous change in me. And sometimes I find it difficult to differentiate between Auroville and India because, first of all, I believe that they're both very intrinsically connected. And also, my discovery of both was parallel because I moved to Auroville, which is in India, and I discovered the Indian culture and the Auroville project at the same time. So things, the borders might be a little bit blurry in my head, but I'm very deeply in love, and I don't use that word lightly, with Auroville and with India and with Auroville in India, right? And so I would say that the fact that arriving there just showed me how little I knew and how limited my previous goals were, or my previous horizons were. That means that I was basically thinking about my life before in a framework that was much smaller. And I realized that that frame was really just one picture in a much larger museum. And that museum was just one museum in a much larger city. And that city was just one city in a much larger country, and so on and so forth. And
And we go
so,
back to Alice and her discoveries.
exactly. And so I was in a frame, and that frame, there's nothing wrong with the frame I grew up with, but all of a sudden I realized there was a lot beyond that. And that's what Auroville in India did to me, is it completely exploded the limits, right? And yeah, this was the interesting thing. The French writer Céline, you know Céline, no? He's
Course, yeah.
written something, and I don't remember if it was in Voyage au bout de la nuit or Mort à crédit, but he's talking about death, right? And his definition of death is, in French, c'est le moment où toutes nos pensées alors s'éparpillent et s'en vont enfin jouer avec... Non, je recommence. C'est le moment où le mouvement du dedans rejoint le mouvement du dehors et toutes nos pensées alors s'éparpillent et s'en vont enfin jouer avec les étoiles. So death is the moment where our inner movement joins the outer movement, and all our thoughts are allowed to spread and go finally play with the stars. And to me, moving to India, in a way, was like a death and rebirth, in the sense that it's a moment where I felt like all of the inner movements and the inner cravings I had were joining a much bigger movement outside that I didn't know existed. So it's as if my skull had exploded and let my thoughts a little bit loose. And I know it sounds a little bit grandiloquent, but it was quite a transformative experience for me.
Yeah. And you say it very well. I was very, very touched by the book. It's also very, very well written.
Merci.
So Auroville in India, we understand that there's just almost as many Indias as there are cities in India, and Auroville is one of them. We also understand that Auroville could only happen in India. That's one of my takeaways. Yeah, it's the openness that you felt in this country.
It's an incredibly tolerant country, culturally speaking and intrinsically speaking. And things change, and it's a very old culture, and it's a country with it's a history spreading back millennia. So you have different phases, and political parties change and situations change, and you have fashions and you have intellectual thoughts coming up and down. But at its core, India is an extremely tolerant country, and it's a country of an incredible wealth where people of all different cultural horizons have always cohabitated to create an incredible melting pot that is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in my life.
So, Julien, you concluded the book by saying that Auroville exists, and that already is extraordinary. And we know that we love this word at Kaelon. And I wanted to ask you, what is your definition of extraordinary?
Well, based on what you just said, I would say that it's exactly that. Is extraordinary what truly exists, And whenever there was not something and then there is something, wherever there was obscurity and then there is light, wherever there was lack of knowledge and there is knowledge, wherever there was terra incognita and then you discover something, wherever there was no company and you create a company, wherever there was no team and you create a team, wherever you create something. And even if that creation you're making is just a different perspective on something existing, because we always stand on the shoulder of a giant and only transform matter that was already there before us. Whenever there is a transformation process and you're a conscious part of that transformation process, extraordinary things happen.
That's beautiful. And what is the most extraordinary experience that you have lived?
Generally, or in a cave, or in life?
I'll let you decide.
To me, there are many extraordinary things, that I've been lucky enough to live through. Again, I was saying how I feel extremely privileged about being able to see the beauty of the caves. And it's something that I feel also in other areas of my life. You know, in August, I drove through Chiapas and Guatemala on a motorcycle, you know, and I was in the middle of the mountains there, like crossing a torrent, crossing a small river with a motorcycle. And all of a sudden, I like stopping in the middle of extraordinary circumstances and taking a step back to be aware of where I am in the here and now. And just again, realizing that it was very unlikely for me to be there, and yet I am there. And so I would say that there are a lot of those moments, a lot of those nuggets of presence where you're in the hic et nunc, in the here and now. And those to me are extraordinary moments that are really special, right? But I would say that my arrival in India was really something where, again, the frame fell apart. So to me, arriving there and seeing that the frame I had lived my life in disappeared was something truly extraordinary. And as for cave diving, I would say that any moment, or particularly, and again, I enjoy any dive. I enjoy every moment I spend underwater, and I enjoy the zero gravity feeling of being weightless and the shared discovery with close friends. But any moment where you stumble upon traces of human activities in a cave is something extremely special. So we've been investigating several places where mining activities have occurred, so which we think are ochre mining activities, and seeing where people have worked, you know, is something incredible, because those caves have been immersed for 8 to 10,000 years. So basically, it's as if you're opening the door to the office of someone who quit work 10,000 years ago, and you go in there and you see the place where they've been mining away, and you see the speleothems they've been using as hammerstones and so on. And this is truly incredible. And in other places, not in the mines and so on, but you know, you do every now and then are lucky enough to stumble across human skeletons, right? Human bones. And to me, when you find human skeletons in a cave, it is something truly extraordinary, because all of a sudden you reconnect an individual to the history of mankind, in the sense that those people went into a cave, got lost, never came out, and then got forgotten for thousands of years. And the day you see them again, in a way, you interact with them, even if you never touch them, you never disturb anything, but you
That's the
see
question
them.
I meant to ask. What do you do? Yes, you leave them.
Oh, so, well, and again, you know, first of all, whatever you find in a cave belongs to the country. And so, for example, here, this is the inheritance of the people of Mexico, and this all it comes under the, you know, the responsibility of the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, the INA de Mexico. And so the thing you do is you report it to the authorities, of course. And if the authorities ask you to help them study, then you can study by doing survey, by doing mapping, by doing 3D models, but it belongs to the people, right? And so that's the most important thing. But to have the privilege to interact, even on a mental level, just seeing those bones and thinking about the person, thinking about the woman who is in front of you and what her life was, and how it has been to walk the earth and be conscious and be in her own hic et nunc, in her own here and now, but 10,000 years ago. And then you come with your own here and now, and it's as if you were creating a connection through time and space, you know, connecting two dots of here and now over 10,000 years. And you know, we were talking about the fact that all our thoughts and so on can be seen on a very poetic way as being part of that noosphere of Teilhard de Chardin. Well, all of a sudden, this is something very tangible, because the humanity of a person who disappeared 10,000 years ago is, their life is being prolonged, her life is being extended in your thoughts for a few more minutes or hours when you stumble upon them much later. And all of a sudden, you reconnect a part of the noosphere to itself. And that's a very, very powerful emotional and mental experience to me.
It's beautiful. You've written books. I know you love reading. You quote. You gave us many quotes today. What is the
Sorry about
book
that.
that? No, that's excellent. What is the book that you have offered the most as a gift?
It's a good question, and I would say there are different phases, like in my life, where I've offered different books, right? So I know that there was
What
a
is the
time
one
in
that
my
you offer now? Let me rephrase.
the one that I offer now, I would say that the one that I've offered the most recently would be a book of poems by Hermann Hesse called Stufen.
Uh-huh.
And
Stufen.
Stufen by Hermann Hesse is a book about
Steps, no?
how,
Stufen.
yeah, exactly, how life is made of different steps, and you should never fear a step. You should never fear the next step, because the spirit of life is to bring you from one step to the next in life to new discoveries. And this is a poem that I find very interesting, because very often when people think of change in their life, of evolving, of going to the next step, there is a fear of reaction to what they will lose, and to say, yeah, but what about everything I've built before? And if you start thinking of everything you've built before, not as something you abandon, but as a necessary step to go to the next step, then the value of it is unharmed. You needed that previous step to go further in life. So it's not like you're abandoning it. You're
It's a
not
continuity.
it's a continuity. And more importantly, the next step wouldn't exist without the previous one. And so for me, that poem, Stufen, which is a very, very poetic way of Hermann Hesse to talk about these things, is something that I've given quite a few times in the past years.
Amazing. I know what I'm going to read next now.
There you go.
What next for Julien?
Well, it's a good question. And again, if I was able to answer that question, then I would be quite disappointed with myself, in the sense that we've spent that entire podcast talking about how you should be ready for the unexpected, and how discovery is exactly being ready for unwanted things to happen, one things to not happen, and to deal with it. So I do
Die
not
nächste
really
Stufe?
exactly.
Yes.
I don't necessarily want to know the next Stufe, the next step, but I know that I have a wish, I have a desire to try to bring a lot of the elements of my very chaotic CV under the same hood. So as you were saying earlier, I have a very messy CV where I've done a lot of different things. And at the moment, through my job as an explorer, through my job as a cave diver, I work currently with an extremely interesting NGO called CINDAC, El Centro Investigador de los Acuíferos de Quintana Roo. And so we study the aquifer through cave diving. And there are many extremely interesting things in there. The least of it not being that, I work with truly extraordinary people, Sam Mitchum, Fred DeVos, Chris Lemayo, Andreas Rosland are really, truly extraordinary human beings I respect and like a lot. And I'm very grateful for them being in my life. But one of the aspects I love in the current job is that it's bringing a lot of different aspects and stuff I've been passionate about in my life: exploration, languages, cultures, science, reading, writing, technical things, sports, engineering, and all of these different elements. So I feel like I've spent a lot of time in my life gathering tools in my personal toolbox. And I'm at a phase in my life right now where I feel like I'm using really, I wouldn't say all of the tools in my toolbox, but a very wide variety of them. So whatever the next Stufe, the next step is, and I don't know what it is, but I want that it goes into a holistic approach of using all of those mental, physical, and spiritual, and emotional tools in my toolbox towards something a little bit holistic.
More holistic. Amazing, Julien. I think we just lost you for perfect. I just lost you for a second, but yeah, we got the point. Something more holistic. So I wish you a lot of joy in following this next step, obviously, and following this guidance from the universe, or whatever is the force that's gonna drive you, with always this great curiosity and openness that characterizes you. Yes. So thank you so much. It was an amazing conversation. I really
You're
enjoyed
welcome,
spending
Sophie. Thank you very much for
this time
having
with
me.
you today. Thank you again, and wish you all the best. Thank you, Julien.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.